June 19, 1944, the Philippine Sea. The Japanese Imperial Navy had never launched so many aircraft at once. Over 370 fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes had lifted off from 4 fleet carriers. They cut through the bright Pacific sky like a spear aimed at the heart of the American Fifth Fleet. But even before the first wave reached radar range, the trap had already been set. On the USS Lexington, Lieutenant Commander Jack Morrison sat in the cockpit of his brand-new F-6F Hellcat, helmet buckled, gloves damp with sweat. He could already feel the tremor in the deck engines warming. He glanced down at his thigh clipboard. CAP sector assignments, vector data, fuel loads, and one line scribbled by hand. Today they learn. Morrison didn't need to ask what it meant. He'd flown Wildcats over Guadalcanal. He defought the Zero before, watched friends vanish in fireballs when they tried to turn with it, when they thought it could be matched on equal terms. The Hellcat wasn't about matching. It was about ending the conversation. On the flight deck the signal came, chocks pulled, engines roared. Morrison shoved the throttle forward. His Hellcat surged into motion, wheels skimming the deck before lifting clean into open sky. He was hunting. They all were. And they had something to prove. The first contact was a glint, dozens of them, tiny silver streaks reflecting off the ocean as they crossed 15,000 feet. The American radar teams had already called out the bearings. Fighters were vectored. Combat air patrols climbing. Intercept wings mobilizing. Morrison's headset crackled. Enemy group confirmed. 100 miles, heading 190, multiple bogies, carrier-borne, it's happening. From above, the sky looked infinite, blue on blue. No cloud cover, just a bright canvas begging to be torn open. Then ahead of them, shapes began to form. Zeros. More than 60. Some flew clean, tight in formation. Others broke off, beginning long, wide turns, scouting, dancing. Morrison remembered that motion. Zeros moved like eels, slippery, graceful, and patient. But this wasn't 1942. The Hellcats closed fast. The F-6F Hellcat was not elegant. It was blunt, thick-winged, heavy, but inside it held 2,000 horsepower and 6.50 caliber Brownings. It could dive at 400 knots and still pull out. It could climb high and hold that altitude. And most important, it could take a hit and bring the pilot home. Morrison's lead wingman, LT, Charlie Ramos, came over the radio. "Jack, looks like they don't see us yet." "They will," Morrison leveled his stick. "Pick your angles, don't play their game." Then he pushed forward just a little, and the Hellcats dropped like stones. Lieutenant Haruto Akabe didn't see the Hellcats coming. Not at first. His eyes scanned the sky ahead and below. He was leading a 6-plane Zero formation, tasked with clearing a path for the bombers behind them. The Zero, like always, felt like an extension of his body. It was light, responsive, almost alive. No armor, no self-sealing tanks, but graceful, precise. His eyes caught something on the edge of the horizon, a strange flash, too slow for flak, too fast for bombers. Then the sun shifted. And from above, like blades dropping from heaven, came the Hellcats. The first .50 caliber burst slammed through the lead Zero before Akabe could even react. A second burst passed so close it shook his wings. He yanked hard to port, slipping into a dive. But the American followed. And the noise, the roar of those 6 Brownings, was like nothing he had ever heard. Not like rifle fire, not like machine guns. This was tearing, this was thunder. Akabe tried to twist. The Zero was still faster in a tight turn. He cut throttle, reversed, tried to force an overshoot, but the Hellcat stayed with him. It should have stalled, it should have broken off. It didn't. More fire, his wings shredded, smoke in the cockpit, then everything flipped sideways. He ejected too late. Morrison's hands were steady. One kill already. He didn't shout, didn't smile. He banked left, rolled beneath another pair of zeros. He watched Ramos get on one, burst twice, clip the wing, and send it spinning like a dead leaf. The Japanese were trying to maneuver, trying to do what had always worked. Sharp climbing turns, low-speed spirals, rolling scissors. But the Hellcats weren't playing that game. They dove, fired, and climbed away. If a zero got behind, the Hellcat broke off fast, pulled vertical, or tanked the hit with its armored belly. This was not a duel. It was a demonstration. Commander Hiroshi Yamashita, squadron leader of the 601st Air Group, saw the massacre unfolding. They had launched believing in their advantage. The Zero had been unmatched for 2 years, agile, untouchable in a dogfight. But the sky told a different story now. One by one, his pilots vanished, some with fire, some with smoke, some with no warning at all. He saw a Hellcat take a burst from a rear gunner, shrug it off, and dive again. He tried to radio his bombers, to tell them to abort, to scatter, but the comms were jammed with screaming voices. "Break off. They're behind us. Too fast, they're too fast." And then a Hellcat pulled alongside him. For 1 second, they were parallel, cockpits level. Yamashita saw the American pilot glance at him, calm, focused. Then the Hellcat banked. 6.50 calibers lit up, and Yamashita's canopy exploded. By noon, over 300 Japanese planes had launched. More than 240 would never return. American losses, just 29. It would be called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. But to the men who fought it, there was nothing funny about it. For the Japanese, it was the day they realized the Zero, their elegant, dancing killer, was now prey. And the Hellcat wasn't just better. It was dominant. The ocean below shimmered with the stillness of defeat. Smoke trailed behind falling aircraft, their final spirals marking graves in the Pacific air. Somewhere above it all, Lieutenant Commander Jack Morrison's Hellcat banked into a lazy climbing turn, his eyes scanning the empty sky. His fuel gauge dipped below a quarter. His guns were nearly dry. It didn't matter. There was nothing left to shoot. His radio, once choked with chatter, was now quiet. The kind of quiet that meant they had done their job so thoroughly. There wasn't even adrenaline left to burn. Lexington Control, Morrison. CAP sweep complete. No bandits remaining, returning to deck. From his altitude, he could still see the outline of a Japanese carrier far off on the horizon, listing slightly. Too far to strike now. But the message had already been delivered, not by bombs, but by wings and guns. This wasn't 1942. This was Coral Sea. This was a new war. And the Hellcat had just announced its arrival. In the belly of a rescue destroyer, Lieutenant Haruto Akabe lay half-conscious on a stretcher, lips cracked, skin burned where the fire had licked through the side of his cockpit. Medics worked in silence. He had been fished from the ocean an hour after bailing out, nearly unconscious from shock. He had never seen an aircraft move the way that one had. The American fighter hadn't been elegant. It was brute force with wings. And yet, in every moment of that duel, it had known exactly what it was doing, as if it had been built to destroy the Zero specifically. He muttered something in his delirium. One of the medics leaned in. Akabe's voice rasped. "They fly like they're already winning." In the weeks that followed, the rumors filtered back through the Imperial Navy. Quiet at first, whispered by returning pilots during debriefings. Then louder. "They climb faster than anything we've seen. I shot one 4 times, it didn't go down. Zeros turn better, but they never get the chance." Inside briefing rooms, chalk scraped against blackboards as commanders tried to draw the turning radius of the new American fighter. But the equations didn't match reality. The Hellcat didn't follow rules. It dove faster than physics should allow. It absorbed punishment that would have torn a Zero apart. It didn't dance, it hunted. And perhaps most terrifying, it was everywhere. By August 1944, in the skies over the Bonin Islands, Japan's veteran pilots found themselves outnumbered 5-1. Carrier wings of Hellcats poured into the sky with mechanical consistency. No flash, no glory-seeking stunts, just wingmen, fuel, ammunition, and brutal efficiency. Flight Petty Officer Osamu Nagai saw it firsthand. He had flown since Pearl Harbor, survived Midway, even returned from the flaming wreckage of Rabaul. But this wasn't combat, it was extermination. His flight of 12 engaged a swarm of blue-painted fighters over Chichijima. At first, he thought they were F-4FS, the familiar stubby shapes of the older Wildcats. Then he saw the wing shape, the profile, the climb rate. Hellcats. 6 were gone before they could even form into a defensive spiral. The rest broke apart. Zeros trying to find altitude, turning desperately, searching for sun angles, all the old tricks. None of it mattered. The Hellcats rolled in with absolute control, firing bursts only when the target was centered, never wasting rounds, never chasing too deep. It was clinical. Nagai managed to clip one in the wing. He saw the spark. He watched the Hellcat stutter just for a moment, then resume the attack. It hadn't even flinched. He broke formation and ran, not because he was a coward, but because he knew what no one else had said aloud yet. The Empire had been outdesigned. Back aboard the USS Enterprise, Morrison leaned against a railing outside the ready room, helmet still tucked under one arm. A fresh sortie was being prepped, pilots briefing, engines testing below. Ramos joined him, cigarette dangling from his lips, his flight suit still streaked with sweat. "That thing back there, you see how one of M tried to climb out of a dive and just stalled?" Morrison nodded. "They're still flying like it's 1941, he said. "Think they'll adapt?" Ramos asked. "They won't get the chance." Behind them, Hellcats were lined nose to tail on the deck, fresh fuel, fresh ammunition. And behind those planes, more carriers. Behind those carriers, more shipyards. And in those shipyards, the future being built faster than Japan could shoot it down. It wasn't just the plane, it was the system. Every American carrier now launched squadrons of F-6FS trained not just to fly, but to outnumber, outgun, and outlast. Every pilot came from training programs that produced more flyers in a month than Japan could graduate in a year. The Hellcat wasn't just a tool, it was a signal. It told the world that America didn't intend to match the Zero. It intended to bury it. At a Tokyo airfield in early September, Commander Yamashita stood beside a wrecked Zero, riddled with .50 caliber holes. Its cockpit burned black, its wings curled like paper. He ran his fingers across the edge of the impact, then stepped back. A young ensign waited behind him. "Sir, what should we tell the instructors?" Yamashita stared at the horizon, where smoke from another destroyed carrier rose faintly into the sky. "Stop teaching them to turn," he said. "Teach them to survive." "Against what?" the ensign asked. Yamashita didn't answer. He didn't have to. The first time the Japanese truly understood the scale of the shift wasn't in the air. It was on the sea. Autumn 1944, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. 4 days that would erase nearly all illusions left in the Imperial Navy. The Japanese had committed everything, carriers, cruisers, battleships, in a desperate push to halt the American advance into the Philippines. But as the first strikes came in, it became clear. Japan no longer dictated the air. It merely borrowed time from it. Carrier after carrier launched wave after wave of Hellcats, their thick frames painted sea blue, teeth hidden behind spinning propeller arcs. They rose from Essex-class decks in brutal columns, leveled into V formations, then vanished over the horizon like flocks of mechanized hawks. By then, the Zero was already obsolete, but it was still being asked to win a war. Flight Petty Officer Shinjiro Ishikawa launched from Zuikaku's deck just after 5:30. His squadron, one of the last fully trained Zero groups left, had been ordered to intercept American strikes heading for Kurita's center force. The radio chatter was clipped and sharp, coded urgent. American dive bombers inbound. Watch for torpedo strikes, they're hunting carriers now. But Ishikawa wasn't afraid of torpedo bombers. He had shot down Avengers before. What concerned him was the unspoken reality. The Avengers never came alone anymore. The Hellcats came first. And when they arrived, they didn't come to duel. They came to eliminate. At 15,000 feet, Ishikawa saw them, streaking across the cloud line like thunderheads tipped in chrome. 30, maybe more. Hellcats. In the chaos that followed, the sky became what every veteran feared, a layered battlefield. Not combat in duels, not contests of honor, but an industrialized storm of altitude, momentum, and angles. The Zero had been born for dogfighting, turn in, slice, spiral, stall out the pursuer, and reverse. But in these skies, such tactics meant nothing. The Hellcats weren't turning, they were striking. Ishikawa rolled into a steep dive to avoid a pair of attackers. One of them followed, just for a second, then pulled up, outclimbing him with infuriating ease. The second looped wide, came in behind his wingman, and within 2 seconds, fired a short burst. The Zero ahead of him crumpled in midair, canopy shattered. There had been no turning, no classic engagement, no time. It was over before either of them could shout. Aboard the USS Franklin, Lieutenant Commander Jack Morrison watched his radar screen go clean. It had taken less than 8 minutes. Hellcats had torn apart the defending fighters. Only a few had escaped. He adjusted his headset and spoke calmly. Strike package has a clear lane. Proceed to targets. No joy, no gloating. Only math. That's what it had become. Not air combat, but arithmetic. You launched 20 Zeros. You lost 18. We launched 30 Hellcats. We lost 2. You had 1 pilot return. We had 28. Do the math, then tell your emperor. Captain Yashio Kamaki watched from the deck of Zuikaku as black smoke rose from the horizon. It wasn't from American bombs, not yet. It was from the destroyed air cover, burning wreckage trailing into the ocean, some still smoldering at impact. He turned to his executive officer. They'll come for us next, he said flatly. Do we have any air cover left? Kamaki didn't answer. He didn't need to. By midday the strikes came. Torpedo bombers, yes. Dive bombers, yes. But just behind them, or sometimes in front, the Hellcats. Dozens of them. Some escorting, some loitering, some diving from altitude to shred anything left in the air, what few Zeros had refueled and rearmed to try again. At one point, Morrison's wing spotted a handful of returning Zeros attempting to limp back to base. He gave the command without emotion. Intercept, no mercy. Within 5 minutes, none remained. It was late in the day when Petty Officer Ishikawa's crippled Zero made it to land. Not to a base, just land. He crashed into a sugar field outside Tacloban, bleeding from a head wound, dazed and deafened. He pulled himself from the fuselage, staring at his cracked instrument panel. 6 kills, 28 sorties, 4 confirmed Americans. And none of it mattered anymore. The sky didn't belong to the brave. It belonged to the factories. To the men flying Hellcats who didn't have to be the best, just well-trained. Just alive long enough to keep pulling the trigger. At Imperial Navy headquarters in Tokyo, the newest intelligence report landed with a flat slap on the briefing table. American F-6F losses, low. 0 losses, near total. Kill ratios exceeding 12-1 in some sectors. Admiral Toyota didn't look up. Then the war is already decided. None of the officers moved. No one disagreed. They had built a war machine on the illusion of agility, surprise, and precision. America had answered with something else. Power, endurance, scale. And in the sky, that answer had a name. Hellcat. In February 1945, the Pacific shifted again. The American fleet, already swollen with new Essex-class carriers and Liberty ships by the hundreds, now floated east of Iwo Jima. Thousands of Marines prepared to land. Over 800 ships surrounded the island, a steel horizon, all supported by a storm of aircraft that blackened the sky from sunrise to sundown. Hellcats were everywhere. They weren't just intercepting now. They were hunting, strafing airfields, blasting dugouts, dropping bombs, pinning down defenders while the Marines waded through volcanic ash and machine gun fire. Above it all, they controlled the sky like it belonged to them by birthright. And to the Japanese men on Iwo Jima, trying to launch one last desperate sortie, it did. Flight Petty Officer Junji Morita had waited for hours in the half-buried bunker that had once been an auxiliary airfield. His Zero had been fueled manually, under camouflage netting, by men who no longer expected to survive the week. He had 10 minutes of fuel in the tank, enough to climb, maybe fire a few bursts, and then glide to sea or death. The mission was simple: find the enemy and kill whatever you could. But Morita already knew what was out there, not by name, not by technical manual, but by feeling. They didn't call them Hellcats. They called them the Blue Demons. They dove from nowhere, ignored your turns, ignored your tricks, ignored your courage. They stayed on your six like they were chained there, and when they fired, it wasn't a snap of rifle fire like the Zeros. It was a wall. He launched anyway. Because orders were orders, because pride was pride, because the world he'd grown up in hadn't yet admitted it was over. He climbed to 10,000 feet before they found him. The warning wasn't radar or even radio, it was instinct. A flicker, a shimmer, a shadow above. He yanked hard, braking left. It bought him 3 seconds, then the tracers came. White-hot slashes, steel lightning. He rolled, pitched down, no hope of fighting, no thought of shooting, just running, but there was no outrunning the Hellcat. The cockpit filled with smoke. The engine sputtered. He opened the canopy just as a second burst tore through the fuselage behind his seat. The last thing he saw before bailing out was the Hellcat banking away, rising like it had never feared him at all. On the deck of the USS Bunker Hill, Lieutenant Commander Morrison reviewed the gun camera footage with the rest of his squadron. Frame by frame, they watched the Zeros tumble. One spiraled into the sea. Another disintegrated midair. 2 had bilayed out, parachutes flowering far too late. Morrison didn't cheer. None of them did. It wasn't a celebration anymore. It was execution. The Japanese pilots they encountered now weren't elite. Many were barely trained. Some had only a few hours in the cockpit. Some couldn't land back on the carriers they launched from. And against that, the Hellcat gave no mercy. At a staff briefing below deck, an intelligence officer delivered the numbers. In February alone, we estimate Hellcats downed over 500 enemy aircraft. Our loss rate is holding below 5%. Carrier launches remain uninterrupted. He flipped a chart onto the table, graphs, ratios, dates, but it all said the same thing. The enemy had nothing left to match this aircraft. And worse, they knew it. Over Tokyo, the Air Defense Command tried to adapt. They issued memos, changed intercept protocols, assigned newer fighter prototypes to try and counter the F-6F. But production was slow. Pilots were few, and nothing they built could match the volume pouring out of American factories. Where Japan had designed elegant warbirds, America had designed a solution. The Hellcat could be flown by a green pilot and still outperform the best the enemy could offer. It could take damage, return home, get patched and fly again. It wasn't the future of air combat. It was its conclusion. By April, the first waves of kamikaze attacks began. And even then the Hellcats were there, waiting. Intercepting them before they reached the fleet, diving head-on into suicides, shooting planes that didn't care if they burned. It didn't matter. The .50 caliber rounds tore through cockpit and fuel tank alike. The Blue Demons still ruled the sky. They couldn't stop every kamikaze. No plane could, but they stopped most. Enough that the fleet survived to launch another strike. Enough that the carriers stayed afloat. Enough that the war pressed forward. Back on land, Japanese veterans gathered in airfield stern ruins, staring at the photos pinned to walls. Pictures of fallen pilots, black ribbon portraits. Some were just silhouettes of what had once been friends. They spoke little. What could they say? They had trained for a different war, one of spirit, one of maneuver and instinct, one where courage could match industry. But courage didn't reload as fast. It didn't climb at 3,400 feet per minute. It didn't carry 2,400 rounds of .50 caliber firepower and still land on a carrier deck in rough sea. The Hellcat did all of that. And more. One day, a young cadet, fresh from the academy, asked a wounded pilot who had survived the Marianas and Leyte, "Senpai, what do we do when we see a Hellcat?" The man didn't laugh. He just stared at the horizon and said, "You die." The pilots who survived the Pacific knew it. The war hadn't ended when the Hellcat was introduced, but it began to feel unwinnable. From Guadalcanal to Okinawa, the arc of the war bent on the backs of the pilots who flew them, and the machines that brought them home. The Zero had made the world fear Japan. The Hellcat made Japan fear the future. July 1945. The home islands burned. American bombers had turned Tokyo, Osaka, and Yokohama into ash. Rail lines were torn, bridges collapsed, cities hollowed out into skeletons. The sky above Japan, once sacred, once unchallenged, no longer belonged to the emperor. It belonged to the Americans. And the aircraft that enforced that truth, day after day, strike after strike, wasn't just the B-29 or the Corsair. It was the Hellcat, the Blue Demon, the aircraft that had taken Japan's proudest weapon, the Zero, and erased its legacy from the sky. From an outpost hangar in Kyushu, what remained of the 343rd Kokutai prepared for launch? 3 pilots, 3 Zeros, one old mechanic who had trained under the engineers who built the first A6M1. The aircraft were patched with scrap, the fuel had been thinned with alcohol, the radios barely worked. They weren't launching to win, they were launching to resist. Lieutenant Junji Morita sat in the cockpit of his rebuilt Zero, staring at the cracked gun sight. His flight suit hung loosely around his frame. He'd lost 20 pounds since Iwo Jima. His hands trembled not from fear, but from starvation. He could see the coast from the runway, and beyond it, the haze where the sea met sky. Somewhere out there, they were coming again. Carrier groups, cruisers, Hellcats. They always came. By mid-morning they were spotted, a massive sweep of American fighters headed inland. Not for a bombing run, this was airspace control, dominance patrols. They didn't even bother to hide. Dozens of Hellcats, flying high and wide in the sun, casting shadows like vultures circling a dying animal. Morita's squadron launched anyway. 3 Zeros. They climbed into the death they already knew waited above them. From the USS Ticonderoga, the call came in clean. 3 enemy aircraft bearing 140 low and slow. Orders. Lieutenant Commander Jack Morrison sat in the Hellcat's cockpit, chewing the inside of his cheek. He'd flown over 60 sorties since the Marianas, shot down over 20 confirmed. He didn't even record them anymore. He clicked the mic. "We intercept." They banked left, 6 Hellcats in formation, not for safety, not for numbers, just habit. They didn't expect a fight. They expected an ending. Morita saw them before his wingmen did. Distant blue specks in perfect formation, sunlight glinting off their fuselages. He didn't radio. There was no point. He opened the throttle and climbed. The old Zero groaned under the stress, engine coughing, wings vibrating. But it climbed anyway, not fast enough, not high enough. The Hellcats saw them. Morrison broke formation. 2 others followed. The rest held above. He wasn't even angry. He didn't feel anything at all. They closed fast. The Zeros didn't scatter. They held altitude like they were welcoming their fate. He didn't wait. The Brownings thundered. 1 Zero burst into smoke immediately, veering sideways, wings folding. Another tried to bank, but the Hellcat rolled inside its turn and fired once, clean, short, and final. Then there was one. Morita. He didn't turn, he didn't dive. He leveled out and flew straight toward the lead Hellcat. For a moment they were on a collision course. Morrison adjusted, ready to split him wide, guns primed. But at the last second, Morita dipped the nose and passed under. No burst, no shot. Just a flash of white metal, streaked with rust and scars. He never fired a round. He just kept flying. Morrison looped, but the Zero was already gone, gliding low over the coastline, vanishing into haze. Later that night, Morrison sat on the edge of the flight deck, his helmet beside him. The war was almost over. Everyone knew it. Hiroshima was 2 weeks away. Nagasaki 3. But what stuck with him wasn't the firebombed cities, not the carriers or the kamikazes. It was that last Zero. The one that flew into a sky it could no longer survive, just to say it wouldn't disappear quietly. Morita landed in a rice paddy 3 miles inland. His aircraft sputtered, then died. He climbed out, boots sinking into mud, breathing hard. He didn't speak. Didn't cry. He just stared at the distant trail of smoke curling in the sky, where a friend had just died, and where another battle had ended before it began. Not because the Hellcat was evil, not because America was cruel, but because the future had arrived. And it had wings too thick for elegance, guns too loud for beauty, and armor too heavy to kill. When the war ended, the wrecks remained. Some Zeros lay rusting in jungle airstrips, vines wrapping around their broken spines. But the Hellcats, the ones that came home, were cleaned, rearmed, sent again, then retired, stored, forgotten. But for every Japanese pilot who had faced them, they were never forgotten. Because they didn't just outgun the Zero. They replaced it. Forever. August 1945. The radio static crackled across the ruins of Kagoshima. Somewhere beyond the broken mountains, a mushroom cloud had risen over Hiroshima days earlier, and now the second one had fallen over Nagasaki. People spoke less now. When they did, they whispered, not out of fear but exhaustion. In a darkened room behind a shuttered airbase, Junji Morita sat alone with his logbook. His last flight had never been recorded. He hadn't bothered. There was nothing left to write. The Empire had called its pilots the sword of the sky, but swords did not survive storms. They rusted. They sank. The Hellcat hadn't just outgunned the Zero. It had ended the idea that willpower could fly faster than firepower. Across Japan, instructors packed up chalkboards covered in flight diagrams that no longer mattered. Training grounds emptied. Hangars became tombs. Engines that had once screamed across the Pacific now sat silent, flecked with rust. The last of the Zeros, stripped, weather-worn, sat under tattered canvas tarps, as if hiding from the sky that had betrayed them. But the sky hadn't betrayed them, it had changed. And America had changed with it. In a hangar in Alameda, California, the Hellcats were lined up wingtip to wingtip, waiting to be mothballed. Some still had kill marks painted beneath their cockpits. Others bore patches over bullet holes. All of them had names, stenciled nicknames like Thunder Lass and Blue Murder, given by the young men who had flown them through the air war of the century. Jack Morrison stood beside his Hellcat one last time. He didn't touch it, just looked. A faint breeze shifted the propeller half a rotation, slow and heavy. He hadn't shot down a plane since June. There was no one left to fight. Far across the Pacific, in a simple wooden house on the outskirts of Tokyo, an old mechanic knelt before a small altar. On it sat 3 photographs, black and white portraits of young pilots in flight uniforms. All were dead. He lit 3 sticks of incense and bowed. Then he placed something beside the offerings, a small fragment of fuselage from a crashed A-6M, bent and scorched, the paint barely visible. His voice cracked as he whispered to the photos. "We asked you to fight with nothing but speed and hope. We gave you no armor. We gave you no second chance. You deserved more." In post-war Japan, few spoke of the Hellcat directly. It was not a plane. It was a presence. It had filled the sky in waves and left only silence in its wake. American occupation forces arrived. Civilians watched in quiet disbelief as American planes landed where the Emperor's sword had once ruled. Some of those planes were Hellcats. No longer hunters, now sentinels. Morita watched one land at Atsugi. Its flaps dropped smoothly. It taxied without fear, engine low and even, like it had nothing left to prove. Because it didn't. At a decommissioning ceremony in Okinawa, an American flight officer addressed his squadron. "We flew them hard, we flew them far, and they brought us home." He paused. "Remember this, the war didn't end because of one plane, but the war couldn't have ended without this one." 1,000 miles away, in a field outside Kure, a farmer uncovered the tail section of a Zero while plowing soil. His son ran to it, wide-eyed, touching the aluminum like it was a relic from another world. "What is it, Papa?" the boy asked. The man stared at it for a long time. "Something that once believed it could rule the sky." He said no more, and the wind carried dust over the fractured tail fin. Somewhere in a museum years later, a Hellcat would be mounted on steel pylons, frozen in a climbing bank, its guns empty, canopy closed, propeller locked in silence. Visitors would walk beneath it, reading placards, taking photographs. But not Junji Morita. He would never visit. He had no interest in monuments. Because for him, the Hellcat was never a machine. It was a memory. And some memories fly too close to the sun to ever come back down.